I'm very depressed. Very, very sad. It's the most sad I've ever been in my life. I'm so sad. Very depressed. I'm very sad. This is depressing.
Explain this, flat earthers. But instead he's like, no, you're a flat earther and you come in here to shill. Basically, right?
Well, I mean, like, he would be the shill because it's like a flat earth endorsed page or whatever. But yeah, the reverse of that on the other aspect of the perspective, yes.
Okay. So yeah.
But like, oh, he did post videos. Like, he posted them.
You're supposed to be hunting.
Oh no. Oh yeah, we. No. Oh yeah.
No, yeah.
History, wrote Norman Cousins, is an endeavor to shatter his loneliness. In today's world, with all the technologies built to connect us, loneliness, one would think, would be easily shattered. But the more we get drawn into the virtual worlds of social media, the worse we tend to feel. To account for this, it is suggested that the medium is the problem. We have become over-reliant on connecting through our devices at the expense of more traditional ways of social interaction. But while there is likely some truth to this assertion, in this video we are going to put forth the argument that it is an inner emptiness, or the lack of a well-defined and effectual sense of self, that is the root cause of the loneliness experienced by so many in our day. One sense of self can be seen as existing on a spectrum. On the one side of the spectrum are those with a strong sense of self. Such people feel they have a place in the world. They know what they want with their lives, and they take the necessary actions to move in the direction of their goals. On the other side of the spectrum are those with a weak sense of self. These are the empty men and women. Such individuals lack a clear conception of what they want with their life. They have no long-term goals around which to structure their days, and so they feel powerless to positively influence their situation. These people tend to drift through life in a passive manner. They follow the path of least resistance and are often crippled by existential doubts. This problem of emptiness, which now afflicts so many in the West, is a symptom of a society in a period of flux. For one's selfhood, or lack thereof, is influenced by the social structures of one's day. In the West, many of the institutions which in the past helped people find their place in the world have fallen to the wayside. The decline of Christianity, for example, has left the West lacking a religious or cultural myth to which people can turn to in order to find a place in this world and a meaning to their life. The growth of the state has also been a force which has contributed to this pathology of emptiness, for the rise of the state has led to the destruction of smaller communities and the degradation of the family unit, which for millennia have been integral forces in the development of one's selfhood. But what has really exacerbated this problem for the younger generations are unfavorable economic conditions. For even if one struggled to find a deeper meaning to their life in the mid to late 20th century, at least one could fall back on the so-called American dream, and by establishing a stable career, purchasing a home, and raising a family, one could develop a more or less adequate sense of self. But for the most part, this dream is dead, and the confluence of all these forces has created a society full of hollow men and women. A society inflicted by a pathology of emptiness is also a society full of anxiety-ridden individuals. For if we feel ourselves to be powerless to exert control over our life, and uncertain of our ability to face up to the challenges of our environment, then anxiety is a natural response. And for the hollow man, this anxiety is most strongly felt during periods of solitude. If we have no other people around to lean on, or to distract us, then our thoughts turn inward, and this leads the hollow among us to become aware of their inner void. Therefore, unlike an individual with a strong and individuated sense of self, for whom periods of solitude can be rejuvenating, solitude for the hollow man is experienced as a painful loneliness and something he must flee from. In generations past, the hollow man would turn to the comfort and security of friends and family, or take part in social events to avoid the anxiety that was triggered in times of solitude. But in the present day, we don't even need to leave the comfort of our home to find the social connections necessary to block out awareness of our emptiness. Instead, we merely need to turn to the comforting glow of our phones and immerse ourselves in the virtual worlds of social media. We can even go as far as to construct a pseudo-self to mask over our empty nature. By selectively posting bits of information about our life online, we can pretend to be someone we are not and feed off the social validation offered by the others who participate in this game. This defensive mechanism, used by the hollow man or woman, whereby they flee to the comfort of the crowd to avoid the anxiety triggered in times of solitude, is also utilized by pre-psychotic individuals in the attempt to avoid a psychotic break. In his book Interpretation of Schizophrenia, Silvano Arietti describes how this process unfolds in the case of schizophrenics. In some cases, writes Arietti, schizophrenia starts with a period of confusion, excitement, and agitation. The patient seems to be eager to make contacts, to reach all the people he knows, to reconnect himself with what seems to be an escaping world. He searches for something that he cannot find. What the schizophrenic is searching for is also what the hollow man lacks, a secure sense of self. In its extreme form, writes the psychologist Rollo May, this fear of losing oneself is the fear of psychosis. The outward turn to the security of the social world usually fails to protect one on the cusp of a psychotic break, and so too does the outward turn to the world of social media ultimately fail to protect the hollow man from his anxiety and loneliness. This solution is like placing a band-aid on a gunshot wound, as the social validation that is gained through social media use is as empty as the people who grant it. For as Rollo May noted in his book Man's Search for Himself, the hollow among us are bound to become more lonely no matter how much they lean together, for hollow people do not have a base from which to learn to love. But what makes this defense against emptiness particularly harmful is that it prevents people from taking the necessary steps to address their lack of a self. The human being, wrote May, cannot live in a condition of emptiness for very long. If he is not growing towards something, he does not merely stagnate. The pent-up potentialities turn into morbidity and despair, and eventually into destructive activities. The true antidote to an inner emptiness is to discover what we truly want with our life and to take the actions necessary to bring that self and life into existence. To accomplish this, we must be willing to face up to our loneliness and the anxiety which accompanies it, for loneliness, as Edward Edinger put it in his book Ego and the Archetype, is a precursor to the positive experience of aloneness. And it is in periods of aloneness that we can begin to learn who we are and what we want with our life. This process is epitomized by the archetype of the hero's journey, or as Joseph Campbell explains, the call is to leave a certain social situation, move into your own loneliness and find the jewel, the center that's impossible to find when you're socially engaged. This is the departure when the hero feels something has been lost and goes to find it. The first step, detachment or withdrawal, consists in a radical transfer of emphasis from the external to the internal world, a retreat from the desperations of the wasteland to the peace of the everlasting realm that is within. But this realm, as we know from psychoanalysis, is precisely the infantile unconscious. It is the realm that we enter in sleep. We carry it within ourselves forever. All the life potentialities that we never managed to bring to adult realization, those other portions of ourself, are there. For such golden seeds do not die. Facing up to our aloneness and cultivating the golden seeds of our being is no easy task, as it requires that we take the bold step of diminishing our need for social validation. For to develop a strong sense of self, we must distinguish ourselves psychologically from our peers. Each of us is unique. We have different innate talents, likes, and dislikes. And so as we strengthen our sense of self, it is inevitable that we will become less like those around us. But we must not think that this process will turn us into outsiders who reject the social world. Rather, those who cultivate a strong sense of self only improve their social skills and enrich their relationships. For a person who possesses the inner strength associated with a well-defined self will not be held back in their social interactions by anxiety or the need for validation. Instead, a strong sense of self will free us to behave with spontaneity, which is one of the most attractive of human characteristics. And as the etymology of the word implies, acting spontaneously means acting in accordance with our will, something that is only possible after we have developed a strong sense of self. If we dare to take this journey, not everyone will approve, and some of the people who we considered friends may even treat us with disdain. For to see a man move beyond the chains of his emptiness only makes the hollow man more aware of his barren nature. Or as Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "Injustice and filth they throw after the lonely one, but, my brother, if you would be a star, you must not shine less for them because of that. And beware of the good and the just. They like to crucify those who invent their own virtue for themselves. They hate the lonely one."
I think it's difficult to know what you want. Can you even know what you want? I don't even know if that's possible. Like you can't touch the tip of this finger with the tip of this finger. What the fuck is there to want? Oh. Yeah, I think like I don't know. I used to want to destroy money and religion and government. That's unrealistic, I guess. I can't achieve that. Then I thought it'd be cool to have a family, but not done well trying to get a relationship. I can't seem to connect with people. Guess I should have learned how to do that when I was younger. And now I'm fucked. So I guess I'm so I'm gonna be alone. So what do I do if I'm alone? I don't understand what to do with my life. What the fuck is there to do? I can't really, so yeah, interacting with people, I pretty much throw that out. So it's just me. So what the fuck do I do? Just, I don't see what's the fuck. This is like nihilistic. What the fuck's the purpose? Should I just explore my mind or something? I don't know.
The fear of finding oneself alone. That is what they suffer from, and so they don't find themselves at all. Human beings are social by nature and unfit to endure extreme cases of isolation. If we are alone for too long, our mental faculties can degrade, leading to states of insanity and deep despair. The use of solitary confinement and exile are practices with ancient roots, indicating that people have long understood just how deeply the fear of isolation runs through our veins. But in the modern day, our fears are not restricted to extreme forms of isolation. Rather, many of us fear being alone for any extended period of time. In this video, we'll investigate this fear, explain the detrimental effects it can have on one's relationships, and explore the benefits of overcoming this fear and learning to find solace in solitude. Many thinkers have suggested that the fear of solitude is at root a fear of oneself. In our normal daily routines, busied with work and chores and most often in the presence of others, our social persona comes to the fore, and frightening thoughts and emotions are pushed outside of our awareness. But when away from the restricting confines of others, these darker aspects of ourselves tend to rise to the surface and make their presence known. It is what one takes into solitude that grows there, wrote Nietzsche, the beast within included. Hence, there is a danger in spending a significant amount of time isolated from others, as there will come a time when, broken down by the beast within, solitude will weigh us down and become a great curse. There are some who
Yeah, I think that happened to me.
can endure this crisis of solitude, and through a heroic effort tame and integrate the darkness within. But most would be destroyed by such a confrontation, which is why Nietzsche thought many should be dissuaded from solitude. The default response for those for whom solitude...
Am I destroyed? So I face the beast to destroy me? Is this the result? The fuck?
Solitariness is too heavy a weight to bear, is to cling to others to ensure they never feel alone. One man runs to his neighbor because he is looking for himself, and another because he wants to lose himself. Your bad love of yourselves makes solitude a prison to you. Those who lose themselves in others may be saved from their solitude, but they always turn out to be crippled versions of the person they could have become. In order for us to actualize our potential, we need to fulfill what the psychologist Abraham Maslow called our meta-needs or highest needs, which include the drive for truth, beauty, and goodness. These needs, as Ernest Becker noted in his book The Denial of Death, cannot be completely fulfilled by other people. It is impossible to get blood from a stone, he wrote, to get spirituality from a physical being. Any attempt to fulfill the totality of our meta-needs through an intimate relationship will result in a godlike idealization of the partner and a resultant slavish dependence on them for our self-worth and identity. If the partner becomes God, they can just as easily become the devil, wrote Becker. The reason is not far to seek. If you find the ideal love and try to make it the sole judge of good and bad in yourself, the measure of your strivings, you become simply the reflex of another person. You lose yourself in the other, just as obedient children lose themselves in the family. No wonder that dependency, whether of the god or the slave in the relationship, carries with it so much underlying resentment. To ensure we don't, like many individuals today, fall victim to dependence-driven relationships, we must develop what the 20th century psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called the capacity to be alone. When the fear of solitude makes us dependent on others, we become overly compliant out of a fear of abandonment, and thus build up what Winnicott called a false self, that is, our personality becomes a mere reflex of how we believe others want us to be. It is in developing the capacity to be alone that the false self can be broken down, thought Winnicott, rendering us able to rediscover our true self, or in other words, our authentic feelings and needs. In the modern day, most are oblivious to the benefits of solitude. Instead, many unknowingly adhere to what is called object relations theory, which is based on two key assumptions: that the maturation of one's personality can only be facilitated through interpersonal relationships, and that these relationships are the primary, if not sole, source of meaning in life. In his influential work Attachment and Loss, John Bowlby, an adherent of this view, wrote, "Intimate attachments to other human beings are the hub around which a person's life revolves, not only when he is an infant or toddler or schoolchild, but throughout his adolescence and his years of maturity as well, and on into old age." Taken to their extreme, the assumptions held by object relations theorists imply that the individual's life has no meaning apart from interpersonal relationships, thus overlooking the well-established fact that meaning can be found and personal growth stimulated when we cultivate, in solitude, a relationship with some form of creative work that consumes our attention. As the 20th century psychiatrist Anthony Storr argued in his book Solitude, A Return to the Self, it is in the struggle to give form and order to an external creative work that we also, often without knowing it, are imposing form and order on our mind. Maturation and integration can take place within the isolated individual to a greater extent than I had allowed for. Introverted creators are able to define identity and achieve self-realization by self-reference, that is, by interacting with their work rather than by interacting with other people. It is this ability to achieve self-realization by developing a relationship with our work that led the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky to claim solitude for the mind to be as essential as food is for the body. In solitude, we can forge our character away from the often constricting external demands of others and maintain our independence in the relationships we do cultivate, thus ensuring we do not, like many today, lose our identity in them. Yet as we learn to flourish in solitude, we must not dismiss the dangers of it which Nietzsche spoke of, dangers which led Goethe to write, "There is nothing more dangerous than solitude." We can increase our capacity to deal with these dangers, however, if we consider the possibility that the benefits of solitude are embedded in its dangers, meaning that it is only by voluntarily seeking out solitude and confronting the darkness within that we can extract the benefits of being alone, and perhaps even eventually attain the rare self-confidence of one who has gained sovereignty over himself. As the poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "You should not let yourself be confused in your solitude by the fact that there is something in you that wants to move out of it. We know little, but that we must trust in what is difficult is a certainty that will never abandon us. It is good to be solitary, for solitude is difficult. That something is difficult must be one more reason for us to do it."
I like that. I like doing things that are difficult.
"I am in that temper," wrote John Keats, "that if I were under water, I would scarcely kick to come to the top." Rare is the individual who goes through life without at some point being afflicted by the anguish to which Keats refers. Sometimes this is triggered by an adverse or tragic event, but often merely reflecting on the discrepancy between how our life is and how it could have been can cast a shadow over our very existence. For most people, these feelings prove temporary. The dark clouds that felt so consuming in the moment lift almost spontaneously, and life resumes on course. But for others, these feelings do not abate with time, but only intensify and depression sets in. One comes to view themselves as worthless, as an object of pity, hate, and anger, and life becomes a burden of the greatest magnitude. The question as to what leads people into the depths of depression has been debated for millennia. Why can some people recover quickly from adversity, while similar circumstances push others into a prolonged misery? Over the past several decades, there has been an increasing focus on the biological causes of depression. But while our genes and biology may predispose us to depression, there is no denying that how we choose to live, and the patterns of thought and behavior we cultivate, are also of great importance. Not all ways of life are equal if we wish to avoid the acute suffering associated with depression. And in this video, we are going to examine one way of life that has repeatedly been identified by philosophers and psychologists as placing one at a great risk for depression. Specifically, we are going to discuss the danger of relying too heavily on a limited number of sources for our feelings of self-worth. As humans, we have a need to feel that our life is of value and that we are here on Earth not merely to take up space, consume resources, and ultimately to die. This need to think well of ourselves and to have others do the same is one of the most fundamental shapers of our life. For without feeling that we are an individual of worth, we suffer, and so much of what we do is driven to satisfy this need. The job we take, who we associate with, the status symbols we adopt, and the social issues we champion are all influenced by whether they help or hinder us in this regard. The more sources we have from which to obtain our feelings of self-worth, the better. But some people, often by virtue of their upbringing, greatly restrict themselves in this regard, and in so doing, they predispose themselves to depression. For depression is often the result of a combination of two factors: the loss of a valued object in conjunction with psychological rigidity, which is the inability to produce variability in our patterns of thought and behavior, and to creatively adapt to changes in our environment. Our risk for both these factors increases the more we rely on one or a few objects for our feelings of self-worth. In some cases, people rely too heavily on another person. Such are the individuals in constant need of the praise of a parent or a spouse to feel good about themselves. Rather than believing they can imbue their life with meaning and become an individual of worth through self-directed action, such people always seek assurance, direction, and validation from what can be called their dominant other. But while those who live like this may have good reasons for having slipped into such an existence, unfortunately this way of life never cures what ails them. For the more we rely on another person to validate our worth, the more psychologically rigid we will become. We will never cultivate the crucial ability to attain self-esteem through our own efforts, and discovering how to feel like an individual of worth without the constant praise of another is a necessary life skill. For if one's dominant other dies or abandons them, the lack of this ability will quickly take its toll, and depression, sometimes of a severe nature, may result. Or as Ernest Becker aptly put it, such a person has lost the only audience for whom the plot in which he was performing was valid. He is left in the hopeless despair of the actor who knows only one set of lines and loses the one audience who wants to hear it. In other cases, rather than relying on a dominant other, some people adopt grandiose life goals in the hope that one day they will achieve such goals becomes the primary source of their self-worth. This tactic is often resorted to by individuals who lack satisfying interpersonal relationships. Perhaps such a person grew up with emotionally distant parents, was ostracized by his or her peers, or experienced too much rejection later in life. But whatever the case, if one repeatedly fails to find the acceptance of others, eventually he is likely to believe that there is something fundamentally wrong with him. He must become someone else if he is ever to become worthy of the love and respect of others. And what better way to do this than by accomplishing a magnificent feat, such as becoming a famous musician, a best-selling author, a successful entrepreneur, or something else of a grandiose nature? Believing that one day he will accomplish his goal and therefore find the acceptance he so desires can imbue his life with meaning and help him feel that he is an individual of worth, or at least on the path in that direction. But like the life lived in the service of a dominant other, this way of life also places one at a great risk for depression. The problem, it must be stressed, is not the focusing on a single goal, as often we need to limit our goals so as not to dissipate our resources. Rather, the risk for depression arises when we stake too much on the achievement of any single goal, especially if the goal is of a grandiose nature. For while some achieve their grandiose goals, most people do not, and as the years pass and the goal remains nothing but a fantasy, the realization eventually sets in that it is unlikely that success will ever be achieved, and therefore, like the individual whose dominant other dies, so too do those who stake their existence on the achievement of a dominant goal also experience a death, but in this case, it is the symbolic death of the individual they hoped to be. When the ambitious man whose slogan is either Caesar or nothing does not get to be Caesar, wrote Kierkegaard, he despairs over it. But this also means something else. Precisely because he did not get to be Caesar, he now cannot bear to be himself. But no matter how we go about limiting the range of sources from which we attain our feelings of self-worth, the problem is the same. When we lose the object on which we staked our well-being, we will be at a loss of where to turn. Or as Silvano Arietti explains in his book, Psychotherapy of Severe and Mild Depression, the depressed person sees a big discrepancy between what he aspired to in terms of human relations and life goals and what he can achieve in this meager reality. He cannot solve the conflict. What is available is not acceptable to him, and what would be acceptable he cannot grasp. He experiences the tragic situation of having no choice. While psychological rigidity, or the foreclosure to alternative ways of living, is especially prevalent in those who live for a dominant other or a dominant goal, we all run the risk of becoming too rigid in our ways. Most people glue themselves a little too tightly to a certain persona or social mask and rely too heavily on things such as looks or other status symbols for their feelings of worth. To avoid the pitfalls of psychological rigidity, we should take a page out of the Stoic playbook and periodically meditate on the fact that we can, and indeed probably will, lose some of the things we value most. The object of your love is mortal, wrote Epictetus. It is not one of your possessions. It has been given to you for the present, not inseparably nor forever. But with that said, when we do lose something of great value, it is likely that we will experience at least a temporary descent into the darkness of depression. These periods, however, should not be viewed as wholly without worth, for often it is during these times that we see the world and our place in it a little more clearly, or as Herman Melville put it, the intensest light of reason and revelation combined cannot shed such blazonings upon the deeper truths in man as will sometimes proceed from his own profoundest gloom. Utter darkness is then his light, and cat-like, he distinctly sees all objects through a medium which is mere blindness to common vision. To avoid descending too deep into the chasm of mental pain that accompanies depression, it should be recognized that there are always alternative sources from which we can attain our feelings of self-worth. But to discover such sources, an active approach to life must be taken. We must try new things and experiment with new patterns of thought and behavior. For while a period of mourning can be beneficial following a loss, a deep depression will set in if we stagnate in such a state for too long. The work of changing, indeed the work of living, cannot be done on one's behalf by another person, wrote Michael Mahoney. We can learn important lessons from those who have gone before us, but ultimately, each of us faces a unique configuration of challenges and a very personal responsibility for the choices we make in moving onward with our lives. We have only partial information, limited understanding, and imperfect control. Yet the physical world and our social communities hold us responsible. Such is our shared existential predicament.
What was that again?
Only partial information.
Well, I don't feel any better. So there's no goal. There's nothing I want. Huh.